Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
And we continue with our look at the Gospel of Matthew. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, and we're moving into a new section. If you remember, for the last 3 weeks, we talked about the 3 pieties that Jesus talked about. Does anyone remember all 3? Does anyone want to give it a shot? I heard alms, that's one of them. Prayer. Fasting. There we go. Now, can you get the right order? Good job. I'm testing you. Well, fantastic. So we're going to take those 3 pieties and we're going to move into this small section about storing treasures in heaven. And I'm sure you know what they are, and we'll maybe chat about that a little bit more. But I wanted to first figure out how you make the transition from the 3 pieties into the storing treasures in heaven, and then it's going to continue on with a couple of other things. And of course, the first thing we should realize is every time that we give alms, we pray and we fast, and we're doing it for God, right, and not for the glory of other people, that we are indeed storing up treasures in heaven. And I thought, well, the treasures in heaven concept, you probably heard that before, and seems so unsimple. So I wanted to try doing something a little different. And that was, again, to just a brief introduction into what we call ancient Bible study methods. And Nick in the back now is drooling because he can't wait to ask his questions. I'm going to ask the questions today, Nick, but I'm sure you'll have others. And our first Enoch group has been spending now over 2 years studying that book by asking questions of every verse. And there should be some interesting questions you should have, because there are a couple of them that I found. And the first one was, what's this connection between a moth and treasure? I don't know about you, but my treasure is in some kind of metallic form or a bill form, or it's in some statement that I don't have to worry about because it's electronic. So you read the Bible, and what I'm hoping to show you today is if you start reading it very slowly and carefully, you're going to start to notice things and hopefully start asking the question, why did Jesus talk about where moth and rust destroy? We're talking about treasures on earth. So that's a good question. And I thought we should take a look at what that means. Wow, that went quick, didn't it? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I got myself a little confused there. I hit the button. Okay, first, today's treasure I already mentioned. Maybe you have some sterling silver, maybe you have some gold, maybe you have some watches. All the ladies here have lots of paparazzi or whatever it's called, jewelry from Joy, right? You're all buying Joy's jewelry? Just say yes. Joy's watching probably. Make her feel good about that. Yes, they're buying your jewelry. And we have these treasures, and we store them in safe, right? Safes in your house, maybe. Or you may have a safety deposit box. Yes, no? You could be like the guy in Louisiana, remember the congressman in Louisiana who had the 75 grand in tinfoil in the back of his freezer behind a glob of ice? Nobody does that? Okay. Some of you hide it in the walls, right? They don't do that anymore either. Okay, that's cool. In Jesus' day, we have to ask the question first, what were treasures? Because the verse doesn't make any sense. Moth and rust destroy unless you say, what were treasures? Well, first we know they're coins, right? They had Roman coins, they had Jewish coins, they had copper coins, they had silver coins. Yes, those were treasures. But there was one other thing that they treasured, and that was clothing. Clothing was a treasure. It was very, very expensive. And you might have had 2, maybe 3, and I'll use the lady's word, outfits. Guys don't wear outfits, do we? We wear clothes. You had the one you wore all the time, every day. And yes, it got dirty and it got stained, and you might have a second one for the day. But most poor people didn't have it. So they had one, maybe 2, but they had a special set of clothes. You know where the word Sunday best comes from? From this time period. Because when they went into the synagogue or the temple to offer their prayers to God, whenever they went to a wedding, whenever they had to go to a funeral, anything that had God with it, they would break out their clothes, their garments, the best. We could consider it our money of that day. Probably even better made, because it's all hand-stitched. It reminded me when I saw the word moth, and I thought of this garments that were treasures, and people would steal clothing. You actually could borrow money, and your clothes could be collateral, by the way. It reminded me of my grandmother, Clara, and she was a wonderful lady. They lived up in the south end of the Bronx, just to tell you something about her. And one week a year when I was very young and very small, believe it or not, I used to go up there for a week, and she would take me into New York City, and we would go into the planetarium. I love the planetarium. Right, Linda, you remember that? This is the New York Linda. A lot of Lindas here. And the Natural Museum of History, that was the night of the museum. And we used to do that for the week. And I love Grandma Clara, and when we got to see her, it was a great thing. But there's one thing she always smelled like. Mothballs. Naphthalene flakes, the chemical name. Mothballs. She was so afraid of the moths getting into her clothes. She used to smell like it. No, she didn't. It was her clothes. Benny, my grandfather, did not like that smell. So he had his clothes in a separate closet. And I did open up one day Grandma's closet when I was a kid, and it almost overpowered me. So mothballs get rid of moths. What people did in Jesus' day, you had this beautiful garment, and what they would do is hide them in the walls. Anyone ever do that in their house? I had a false wall in my first house. None of you had it? Where you could take the panel off, and there it is. Well, they did that. Remember, I did mention the inner room last week where you kept valuables. You also kept valuables in walls. So you would put your garments in. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing really wrong with it, but your houses were not exactly built to today's specs. You had dirt floors. And in the rainy season, the ground got very damp. Ask Nancy about damp. And that dampness got into the walls, right? Because they were dual-layered walls, and because of the dampness, because of the climate, they had a lot of bugs and a lot of moths. And the moths could get into the wall and eat your garment. That's the reference he's making to. So people who heard Jesus say this, and he said about moths, they instantly said, I know what that means. You're talking about my expensive garments in the walls, and they could be destroyed. Then I read this word rust, and I thought, what could they possibly own as a treasure that rust? Do you have any treasures that rust? You might have a little tarnish, right? But I always thought that rust was from iron, right? You take iron. I love to, does anyone cook with iron pans? I love my iron pans. But if I don't dry them properly, which does happen from time to time, and you get up the next morning, what's on the pan? Rust. I'm like, okay, well, that's not a treasure. I wouldn't stick my iron pans in the wall because someone might steal them. That would be kind of silly. So the best thing to do is you look up this rust destroy, you go to the original language, and it's up there in Greek, and the word brosis can be translated as food, eating, and in certain places in the New Testament it's translated as rust. Most of the dictionaries don't even say rust. Therefore, think about a moth. What does a moth do to the garment? It eats it, right? So, I think a better translation is where moths eat as food. Your treasures are being where moths eat as food, thus destroying it. That's what you were concerned about. So understanding the culture helps us to understand what Jesus was talking about. Where moths eat and destroy, if you want to shorten it down a little bit. Now all of a sudden it makes sense. I garment's in the wall. My moth is going to eat it. Jesus says, put your treasures not in your walls, put them in heaven, because guess what? There's no moths up there. That's pretty cool. Be nice to get rid of all the bugs. So the cultural content starts to tell us what the verse is about. And hopefully you've read that verse, and I've read it for years, and I went, moth and rust, okay. I didn't get real worried about what that meant, because Jesus is saying treasures in heaven are more important. But nowadays we want to read this nice and carefully and fully understand it. Right, Mick? Right. Makes sense now? There we go. Mick's happy, I'm happy. Earthly treasures cannot be taken into heaven. Sometimes you got to remind people that. I think everyone knows that. And have you ever heard of the story of the check at the graveside? There was a widow who was at her husband's funeral, and everyone, of course, is offering prayer and is weeping. And the minister noticed that she dropped a check into the grave. And so the minister came to her and said, why did you do that? Put a check in the grave. And she said, because my husband said throughout his years, he's taken all of his money to heaven. So I put it in the grave, hopefully he can find a bank in heaven. You can't take it with you. We're also called stewards of everything we have. See, everything is God's. It's what we learned in Exodus 25, where God takes his portion. All of this is God's, it's not ours. And we're temporary stewards of everything. So all your earthly treasures, and I hope you do have some, because Jesus did not say you can't have earthly treasures. It's when you value earthly treasures more than you value heavenly treasures. And heavenly treasures are not really hard to do. They're good deeds. They're when you pray, like the pieties, when you give alms, when you give to different, whatever, organizations or causes. That's what it's all about. Earthly treasures can perish, but heavenly treasures are eternal. And when you get to heaven, it's those treasures that you want to have. Because you can't, like I say, you can't take your car, you can't take your money, you can't take your house. So you work on these treasures. These are also random acts of kindness. All of these things come together so that when we get to heaven and we have that little house that Jesus built for us, that's John 14, we are ready. Because our treasuries in heaven are going to be full, aren't they? So think about all those random things that you do, nice things for people that you don't even know. And God's up there and this little counter going on. And I'm sure when each of us get to heaven, then we're going to find out that our coffers are full of treasures.